more disconcerting and stopping all the conversations. I mean, I want to get started, and yet you're doing exactly what it is that we designed this event to do, to bring you together with one another, to engage in conversations. So, that is what we're going to do tonight. My name is Warren Frisina. I'm the Dean of the Stuart and Nancy Rabinowitz Honors College. And let me just begin by saying in a formal way, which I didn't get to do at the barbecue that got rained out. Remember that barbecue? I do have to apologize on behalf of Hofstra's weather control system. I know that all the pictures you ever saw of Hofstra had people sitting in nice sunny spaces on the lawn and everything, 70 degrees even. I can't really account for what happened, but they're working on it, and I'm sure that we won't see any rain like that again. Anyway, I would have welcomed you at the barbecue in an informal way, and this is a bit of a more formal occasion, but I do want to just begin by saying how delighted, how excited, and how proud we are that you've chosen to come to Hofstra, put your trust in Hofstra, put your trust in the Honors College. We are going to do the best we can to make sure you have exactly the kind of educational experience you're hoping for, and that it launches you in exactly the ways that you want it to when that time comes. But not too soon, you got several years. So, it is an extraordinary treat to look out across this room and see 1/3 of your lovely, smiling faces. Of course, I'm making an assumption here, and only 1/3 is all I can see. But seriously, it's been so long since we deans and faculty can be together with our students in this way that I would just like to savor the moment a bit, if you don't mind. I really could just stand up here and just look at you for a good 30 seconds. You start to get uncomfortable, but know that I am deeply appreciative of this. I know the masks are annoying, but if they keep us safe and if they enable us to be together, I am more than willing to pay the price. Now, some few of you might be wondering what this thing called the Aims of Education is about. Why are we gathering tonight, right in the middle of all the fun and games that are rightly the main focus of Welcome Week? How many of you passed by the mini golf in the library thing? Don't miss it. After this is over, go on upstairs and enjoy it. So, before introducing my colleagues and our speaker, let me explain why our deans and faculty have gathered here tonight with you. The Honors College mission is to do whatever we can to enrich your college experiences, both in the classroom and beyond. But what does it mean to enrich something? Well, some 60 or so of you got a taste of the kinds of things we do to enrich your life outside the classroom via those Honors College trips that we had this weekend. When the semester begins, you'll all be getting emails from us alerting you to similar trips, programs, and activities, some involving events on campus, but many that will bring groups of students into the New York area to experience things you might not find on your own. And best of all, remember this, and best of all of our trips and programs, including the food, are always free. So you'll want to take advantage of as many of these opportunities as you can. But enrichment in the classroom doesn't involve bringing you to new physical spaces. It almost always involves creating opportunities in C&E, in honors options, and in honors seminars to step back from the subject at hand and reflect on the fundamental questions that drive whatever mode of inquiry you happen to be pursuing. Let me explain via a couple of examples. It's one thing to learn in engineering about how to build a bridge. It's another thing to be asked to reflect on whether a bridge is needed and who will it serve. It's one thing to gather the information you need to perform medical procedures that will save lives and reduce suffering, and another to reflect on inequities in our healthcare system and their implications for the very practice you hope to pursue. It's one thing to understand how the powerful political forces that led up to a specific moment in history did so, and another to reflect on how that information should shape our contemporary conversations about the pursuit of justice. What I'm describing is what we academics sometimes call the meta-questions. They can be pursued in all fields. They come up when we step back and look away from what we are doing to see better why the subject is of interest at all. Meta-questions are one of the ways we discover for ourselves who we are and what our values, what values are driving our ambitions. This night, as you are about to embark on your undergraduate education, we've invited a distinguished faculty member to model for you what it means to step back and ask the meta-question when it comes to education. We asked him to reflect on the question, what are the aims of education? We don't presume there to be just one answer to this question. In fact, we've also invited 25 faculty and administrators who all will have their own takes on the subject. We've invited them to initiate a post-lecture conversation at your table. You see, our goal tonight is not to tell you what the aims of education are. That would be presumptuous. Our goal is rather to set the stage for you to begin to think out loud with your colleagues about this question. That is why we brought you together. We do this because we see this kind of reflection as the first step in the enrichment of your college education. Now let me begin by introducing all of the faculty and administrators who have come out on a Monday night where while they're preparing, getting ready for class and all those kinds of things, but come out to volunteer their time to be with you. And I want you to, when I finish the list, be deeply appreciative of these volunteers. I'll begin with a very special introduction, someone who has already introduced herself to you as a fellow fresh person. That is our newly installed president, Dr. Susan Poser. Then we have Dr. Tamika Robinson, who is the Senior Associate Dean and Professor of the Honors College and Professor of Rhetoric and Public Policy. Dr. Lauren Grudnak-Kolzel, Associate Dean and Professor of Writing Studies. Dr. Carrie Jensen, Professor in Global Studies and Honors College Mentor. Dr. James Bernhardt, Professor of Geology and Sustainability and also an Honors College Mentor. Dr. Andrea Libresco from the Teaching, Learning and Technology Department. Julie Yindra, the Director of Student Access Services. Dr. Frank Gowen, who is a professor in writing studies and composition and also works with the INTO international student groups. Dr. Lisa DeTora, professor of writing studies and composition. Dr. Rosanna Parati from the political science department. Dr. Abraham Mantell from forensic science. Dr. Philip Mark from chemistry. Thea Barden from student counseling. Louise Waters from student counseling. Dr. Jenny Roberts, speech, language, hearing sciences. Dr. Kevin Boston Hill from writing studies and composition. Dr. Christopher Dipple from drama and dance. Dr. Karen Valerius from the English department. Dr. Donna Willenbrock from nursing. And the person with the longest tenure in the room, Dr. Mike DiNicenzo from the history department, who has taught here for well over 50 years. Dr. Ann Werlein from religion, and Dr. Martine Abbott from community health. It's a lot of folks. quotes, but I wanted to say each name individually because I am so deeply grateful to my colleagues for coming out to help us tonight. So now it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Craig M. Rustici, a colleague whom I have known for over 20 years. I had only been at Hofstra for a couple of years when I found myself immersed in a conversation about how important it was for Hofstra to upgrade its honors program to a full honors college. Dr. Rustici was an important member of that task force, charged with imagining what honors college would look like and how its curriculum would be structured. He is therefore partly responsible for all the ways that C&E and the honors curriculum more broadly will be enriching your education over the next 4 years. Dr. Rustici is a professor of English and director of disability studies here. He holds a PhD and MA in English from the University of Chicago and a BA from Lafayette College. He's chaired the Hofstra English department and founded Hofstra's minor in medicine, culture, and study. Initially trained as a scholar of early modern British literature, Dr. Rustici has published articles in Modern Philology, Studies in Philology, Spencer Studies, and Renaissance and Reformation, all prime journals in his field. He's contributed chapters to collections on Queen Elizabeth I and on depictions of India and Indians in early modern literature. His book, The Afterlife of Pope Joan, analyzes representations of an apocryphal medieval woman who reportedly cross-dressed her way into the papacy. Many of his colleagues are desperately waiting for the movie version of that book. As part of Hofstra's Digital Research Center, Dr. Rustici, who is legally blind, developed Access Scholar, an initiative to promote the accessibility of digital humanities projects for individuals with sensory, motor, or cognitive disabilities, and he advised the Digital Research Center on project accessibility. He's presented papers on disability studies at Hofstra conferences and at conventions or conferences of the Modern Language Association, College English Association, and the New York College English Association. As Director of Disability Studies at Hofstra beginning in 2018, Dr. Rustici built upon the work of his predecessors and expanded this disability studies curriculum. He's recruited and advised a team of students researching disability entrepreneurship programs for the Viscardi Center's National Center for Disability Entrepreneurship. Their research has prompted an initiative to create a consortium of such programs. He's been interviewed by Newsday on disability history and contributed to the Walthrop News Service article on living with disabilities. Oops, lost my paper. Living with disabilities. He's currently helping students found a chapter of DREAM, Disability, Rights, Education, and Mentorship, a national organization for students with disabilities and their allies. As I mentioned at the beginning of this introduction, Dr. Rustici helped to shape Honors College and culture and expression in particular. In the subsequent years, I have gotten to know him best as a regular member of the C&E teaching team. In fact, it was his lecture on Shakespeare's The Tempest that was my first inkling of how critical race theory can bring to light dimensions of a text that had been overlooked for centuries. His analysis of what Shakespeare was pursuing in his portrayal of the character Caliban, if you know the play, rewrote the way I experienced that play and opened me to see things I had missed. With all of this as background, I am confident that all of us are in for a similar experience tonight, as Dr. Rustici reflects on the aims of education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rustici.
Thank you. Very kind introduction. I also want to express my gratitude to Deans Racina, Robinson, and Kozel for giving me the opportunity to speak with you tonight. As Dean Racina mentioned, some of my best teaching experiences have been in Honors College. And I've been a participant in these events several times. I kind of confirmed tonight with Dean Racina that included the first one. So I've been at this for a while. I also want to thank my colleagues for turning out and making this work. In particular, I want to thank Dr. Poser for, through her presence here, expressing her engagement with the work we do. And finally, I want to thank the entering class of Hofstra Honors College I'll thank you a little bit in advance for listening, for thinking and responding, and for allowing me the honor of helping to launch your careers in the Honors College. Although Dean Frisina introduced me, I'm going to say a little bit about myself and my background before I turn to our topic. Oh, we got to advance. Go back. I consider myself experientially closer to the journey you are about to undertake than I might at first appear. I began my academic career as a scholar and teacher of British literature written before 1800, and I focused on that field for more than 2 decades. In recent years, though, I began to learn a new interdisciplinary field: to write, present, and teach in disability studies. I shifted from teaching Shakespeare, as Dean Frisina mentioned, and writing about androgynous queens, colonialist discourse, and the allegedly transformative properties of tobacco, to teaching and writing about H.G. Wells, Kurt Vonnegut, eugenics, disfigurement, and most recently, disability history at Hofstra. Amid that transition, I even completed an internship of sorts on loan as a program officer for 1 semester at the National Endowment for the Humanities. So I've recently been in your position, preparing for new forms of thought and inquiry. Personal experience drew me to disability studies, albeit belatedly. I was born legally blind due to damage to my optic nerves. So my eyesight is sufficient to navigate a building, but not to drive a car or read an unmagnified computer screen. In my youth, I experienced what disability scholars term the medical model, a view of impairments as individual misfortunes to be cured, if possible, by authoritative medical practitioners. When I entered college, disability studies as an academic discipline was just beginning to take shape. Even if I had been aware of it, though, I wasn't ready. I thought of my impairment as a weakness and embarrassment, something that, unlike other people with disabilities, I could attempt to hide. I did not think of it as an identity to embrace, an opportunity for collective action, or a subject, or a subject for scholarly inquiry. I turned to disability studies as I gradually took advantage of the opportunities you too will enjoy in an academic setting, to be in conversation with scholars, to gain fresh insights into myself, and to acquire conceptual frameworks for understanding my experience. So it looks as though I've already begun discussing the aims of education. A few months ago, when Dean Frisina invited me to give this talk, I asked for a few days to think it over and sort out what I might have to say. I decided to follow the lead of my colleague Tom Kauser, who founded Hofstra's Disability Studies program. Shortly after Hofstra established the Zucker School of Medicine, he published an essay entitled "What Disability Studies Has to Offer Medical Education." Tonight, I plan to focus my talk on what disability studies reveals about the aims of education. That leads me to a few content warnings and a word about terminology. The history of disability includes great accomplishments, but also neglect and abuse. As I draw examples from that history, I will touch upon troubling topics including medical neglect, assisted suicide, euthanasia, and forced sterilization. Almost always in fairly general and not graphic terms. Tonight I will use the phrase people with disabilities and disabled people interchangeably. You may be familiar with the rationale behind person-first language, such as people with disabilities. We choose such phrases to avoid reducing complex individuals to a single, often stigmatized trait. Some disability activists, though, prefer the term disabled people because it conveys a fundamental premise of the disability rights movement. That is, in many cases, a physical or mental anomaly is a disability only if the physical or social environment makes it so. In a building equipped with ramps and elevators, paraplegia might not be much of a disability. In a 6-story walk-up, it would be. All right, so that is obviously not a picture of a 6-story walk-up. It is a picture from our own archives, and it was a picture that was used early, say, in the late 1960s or 1970s to help make a point about and promote Hofstra's efforts to be an accessible campus. I'm pretty sure it's the entrance to the Cranford Adams Playhouse. Because the phrase disabled person suggests that disability is something done to or imposed upon people with anomalous bodies or minds, it appears to convey the notion, central to the social model of disability, that the environment disables. To give you a roadmap, here are the major topics I will address tonight. Since you've already lived through the Great Recession and a COVID recession, the connection between education and employment is likely an elephant in the room. So let's address that right away. Knowledge of the lives of people with disabilities in this country cultivates keen sensitivity to employment anxiety. Both the unemployment rate and the poverty rate for disabled people is double the rates for people without disabilities. As of 2017, 29% of people with disabilities lived in poverty compared to 12% of people without disabilities. And so since we are discussing the aims of education, let me add that according to a 2017 study from the National Institutes of Health, just 5% of disabled American adults had earned a bachelor's degree compared to 27% of adults in the general population. As new members of the Hofstra community, you can take pride in the work of Hofstra alum Neil Jacobson, who, by the way, figures prominently in the Netflix documentary Crip Camp. Actually, along with another Hofstra alum, Neil Jacobson gets more screen time, but Ann Coppola, who's also interviewed in that documentary, was also a Hofstra alum. After graduating with a BS in mathematics in 1974, Jacobson, who lives with cerebral palsy, moved to Berkeley to join the independent living movement. There, he co-founded a program to train people with disabilities as computer programmers. By 1994, 300 students had completed the program and 92% had found competitive employment. Jacobson went on to become Senior Vice President at Wells Fargo and to direct their information technology for decades. So by summarizing Jacobson's career, I don't mean to suggest that computer programming is the only path to employable skills. My colleagues in computer science don't need that plug, and I'm an English professor. In fact, the lives of disability activists demonstrate the error of trying to force people into seemingly pragmatic fields and careers. Government rehabilitation agencies frequently offer tuition support to disabled people, but with strings attached. For example, in his provocatively titled essay, Why I Burned My Book, if anybody wants me to explain later on, we will. Groundbreaking disability historian Paul K. Longmore explains the California Department of Rehabilitation declined to fund his graduate studies in history, but offered to pay to train him as a computer programmer. So, publications, books published is a kind of reductive way of measuring the accomplishments of a college professor. But I think at least will do the work here to show that California was wrong, right? They would have been investing their money very well in supporting Paul K. Longmore. He published 4 books, many articles. His university has founded a study center in disability studies in his honor. Closer to home, disabled Hofstra alum Connie Panzarino, who after considering a medical career had decided upon becoming a writer, reports in her memoir that she knew the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation would make tuition support contingent on the results of an aptitude test and selection of an appropriate major. Consequently, she purposely answered science questions incorrectly. She neglected, though, to sabotage her performance on math questions as well, and her rehabilitation counselor initially offered her aid if she agreed to become a mathematician. Panzarino ultimately graduated from Hofstra with an English major and from NYU with a master's in art therapy. She went on to publish her memoir, plus several books for children, to work as an art therapist, director of the Boston Self-Help Center, and a lesbian disability activist. I hope these examples encourage you to think of employable skills expansively and to seek occupations that can become your life's work. Keep in mind, too, that we do not yet live in an employment meritocracy. Studies continue to reveal, for example, that some employers look less favorably upon the same resume when attached to a stereotypically black rather than white name. So in addition to developing your personal skills, you may need to work for a society that more consistently makes decisions based on those skills. Education can also expose the nonsense in common sense. This notion may be at least as old as Plato's allegory of the cave, in which common sense tells the prisoners in the cave that the shadows cast on the walls are real things. Disability studies illustrates especially well the potentially high stakes in discrediting common sense. Common sense tells us that the quality of life for people with disabilities is poorer than for the non-disabled. Would you prefer to be able to see or walk than to be blind or reliant on a wheelchair? This idea appears regularly in Hollywood films in which suicidal disabled protagonists choose death over disability. The 2016 movie Me Before You is a recent example. Some of you may know this film. I, for a couple of years, had been reading student papers about it, and in preparing these remarks, sat down and watched it. If you have seen it, you kind of know the screenwriters have almost tried to eliminate every other possible variable for the protagonist to spare, aside from his quadriplegia. As you can tell, he's handsome. He's wealthy enough to own a castle. He's cultured. He appreciates foreign films and classical music. He has cheerful and competent health aides taking care of him. He has very good assistive technology, a motorized wheelchair, a accessible van, and as you could probably also tell from the movie poster, he has a beautiful woman in love with him who, with an apparently unlimited budget, has decided that she will plan excursions to make life pleasant for him. The only thing in that movie that would seem to account for his choice of suicide is his quadriplegia and the associated complications. And they even underline it a little bit more because one of the last scenes of the movie is his beloved, after he's gone to Switzerland to commit suicide, and she's reading over the letter he's left for her. The last words of that letter is "live well." So they kind of underline quality of life as one of the crucial issues in the film. According to disability activist, lawyer, and memoirist Harriet McBride Johnson, the Better Off Dead motif traveled off the silver screen and onto the streets of Charleston, where passers-by sometimes stopped to tell her, "If I had to live like you, I think I'd kill myself." In fact, studies show a sharp discrepancy between the quality of life that people with disabilities experience and that non-disabled people project for them. For example, one study found that only 18% of emergency care providers believed they would be glad to be alive after experiencing a spinal cord injury, whereas 92% of actual survivors of such injuries report they were in fact happy to be alive. When they influence medical decisions, common sense assumptions about disabled quality of life can become life-threatening. Connie Panzarino, who lived with a degenerative neuromuscular disease and developed an ulcer while a student at Hofstra, recounts physicians debating her care. I'm quoting her here. The first doctor argued that transfusions and extensive treatment would be a waste of time and money, since I was disabled and going to die anyway. The second doctor argued that a transfusion really wasn't that expensive and that antacids, jello, and milk were not considered extensive treatments. Thanks to that second doctor, Panzerino lived decades longer, dying at age 53. No doubt the American healthcare system is always rationing care, often based on patients' ability to pay, sometimes based on views like those expressed by the first doctor in Panzerino's anecdote. In times of crisis, though, healthcare rationing becomes more overt. As the masks that you're all wearing remind us, we are now living through such a public health crisis. Until the Office of Civil Rights intervened in spring 2020, Alabama promoted emergency protocols that if ventilators were scarce, would deny them to individuals, I'm using quotations, this is not the phrasing I would have used, with profound mental retardation and moderate to severe dementia. Similarly, Tennessee's protocols would have withheld critical care in situations of scarcity from, quote, people with spinal muscular atrophy who need assistance with activities of daily living. Right, as it turns out, Harriet McBride Johnson and Connie Panzerino were people with spinal muscular atrophy. That was the disease they were dealing with. So under these Tennessee guidelines, both Harriet McBride Johnson and Connie Panzerino would have been denied scarce care in order to make it available to less disabled individuals. Reassessing our common sense assumptions about quality of life can help protect people with disabilities from such medical bias. Education will also enable you to question authority thoughtfully, not reflexively. Two troubling moments in American disability history demonstrate the importance of that capacity. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on the constitutionality of a Virginia law authorizing the compulsory sterilization of, quote, mental defectives, institutionalized in state facilities. You may recognize the names of several justices deciding the case. William Howard Taft is so far the only person to serve as both President and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Louis Brandeis was an innovative jurist who promoted the use of sociological and statistical data in legal briefs. There's now a term, Brandeis briefs, to identify that, and who in his opinions began forming a foundation for the right to privacy. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the son of a poet and a talented wordsmith in his own right, coined phrases that are part of our popular discourse: shouting fire in a theater, present danger, and free trade in ideas. All three joined the 8-to-1 majority upholding Virginia's law to sterilize the so-called feeble-minded against their wills. Much was wrong with this decision. Thanks to researchers, we now know that the plaintiff, Carrie Buck, whom Virginia then sterilized, had no cognitive disability. Her lawyers, acting upon a conflict of interest, failed to represent her adequately. More widely, the case indirectly affirmed in a related decision in 1942 authorized the compulsory sterilization of more than 60,000 Americans, provided a precedent cited by Nazi doctors at the Nuremberg trials, and was never overturned. Here I'm not urging you to disregard expertise. We have recently seen considerable harm done by dismissing scientific or medical expertise. And universities like Hofstra rightly cultivate expertise. They also cultivate critical thinking and multiple literacies. Partly because the style Holmes used in the Buck decision, and he was the one who wrote the decision, was elegant and accessible, far from stereotypically opaque legal writing. An educated person can readily detect the flaw in at least one of his fundamental arguments. I'd like to try to demonstrate that. The Buck case grew out of the early 20th century eugenics movement and the determination to prevent the nation from, as Holmes puts it, being, quote, swamped with incompetence, unquote. At first, to protect the gene pool, those presumed defective were segregated and incarcerated in state colonies. Although in many cases the labor of those held at these colonies was exploited, the cost of maintaining such facilities for lifelong residents appeared to burden the state. Once sterilized, though, those, quote, defectives, as Holmes explains, might be discharged with safety and become self-supporting with benefit to themselves and society. 2 paragraphs later, though, Holmes, motivated by mercy, it would seem, argues that it is better for all the world to sterilize defectives instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility. Here, 2 paragraphs after asserting that defectives to be sterilized would become self-supporting contributors to society, Holmes suggests that their children are inevitably destined for the gallows or the poorhouse. An alert, educated reader can readily perceive Holmes' self-deception. Holmes' self-contradiction. Excuse me. So my point here is not narrowly that education will empower you to question the authority of non-disabled dead white men. Rather, more broadly, it will teach you to evaluate the argument rather than the arguer. And allow me to offer a further illustration. In Chicago in 1915, an infant was born with multiple physical anomalies, including a prematurely hardened skull, a missing ear, and a life-threatening intestinal blockage. His pupils reacted to light slowly, suggesting possible brain damage as well. The hospital's head of medicine persuaded the parents not to request life-saving surgery, and 5 days later the infant died. The doctor did more than that, though. He publicized the case widely in order to advocate the practice of allowing defective infants to die. Not surprisingly, the deaf-blind advocate Helen Keller spoke out. Shockingly to me, though, she supported the physician and the practice, as she put it, of weeding the human garden. In a letter published that year in the New Republic, she asserted, "The possibilities of happiness, intelligence, and power give life its sacredness." She went on to characterize the infant as a poor, misshapen, paralyzed, unthinking creature, and argued the toleration of such anomalies tends to lessen the sacredness in which normal life is held. Despite her lived experience of disability, Harvard education, co-founding of the American Civil Liberties Union, and advocacy for people with disabilities, Keller's case for euthanasia should not pass unquestioned. For my next point, I will return to my intellectual roots in literary study. The Russian literary critic Viktor Shklovsky has argued that one function of literature is to defamiliarize or estrange routine experiences, to slow us down and prevent us from perceiving the world on autopilot. I contend that education can do something like that as well. In fact, while preparing these remarks, I learned that anthropologists and sociologists embrace, quote, making the familiar strange as a central disciplinary objective. Shklovsky's own examples point to the progressive potential in making strange. In one instance, Leo Tolstoy's uncomprehending narrator describes a flogging without conventional vocabulary and as if seeing it or even hearing of it for the first time. In a second instance, Tolstoy's narrator is a horse, struggling to grasp the human concept of owning property. As Shklovsky observes, Tolstoy uses defamiliarizing to, quote, prick the conscience, unquote, to encourage criticism of contemporary social practices. Making the familiar strange can help us recognize that the current state of affairs is not natural or inevitable. Things could be different. History and anthropology contribute to defamiliarizing by informing us of chronologically or geographically distant cultures in which things are different. Thus, just a few decades after Europeans became aware of the Americas and of the radically unfamiliar cultures there, Thomas More, writing in Utopia, imagined an alternative, possibly ideal society set in the Americas and described by a fictional European explorer. Learning about unfamiliar cultures prompts us to imagine our cultures taking different shapes. Once again, disability studies offers a powerful illustration. The opposition between normal and abnormal, so central to our conception of human mental and physical diversity, seems natural, inevitable. Leonard J. Davis has observed, though, that before 1840, the word normal did not mean standard, healthy, or sound. Instead, normal was a geometric term, meaning perpendicular, or pertinent to our conversation tonight, an adjective describing schools that trained teachers. For Davis, this linguistic fact is just the tip of the conceptual iceberg. He argues that our present concept of normal arose only when factors such as the development of statistics, representative democracy, and industrial mass production converged. Before the 19th century, people conceived of an ideal body that no one could attain, rather than a normal body that everyone should attain. Davis's theory uses history to make our familiar concept normal strange, and to suggest that normal is not necessarily a natural or inevitable way of thinking about human creation. Davis thus prepares the ground for, as he puts it, the end of normal. Sorry, that was, let me go back and explain a little bit. So in terms of the language, the normal curve is crucial in his argument, and he really sees the rise of statistics as contributing to this notion of normal. It helps him that one of the crucial thinkers in statistics was also one of the crucial thinkers in eugenics, Francis Galton. And a small shout out to Dr. Poser. Leonard Davis has for a long time been working at the University of Chicago, I'm sorry, the University of Illinois at Chicago, which is the institution from which we stole Dr. Poser. Finally, for you, for all of us, I hope that education enables you to make peace with human limitations. Many disability scholars have addressed what makes disability so disruptive, so disturbing for the non-disabled. Tom Shakespeare has captured well what others have expressed in similar terms. He writes, "People project their fear of death, their unease at their physicality and mortality onto disabled people, who represent all these difficult aspects of human existence." People with disabilities can provoke fear because through injury, disease, or aging, anyone can acquire a disability. To convey this, disability activists sometimes replace the phrase able-bodied with temporarily able. Shakespeare continues, "It is not just that disabled people are different, expensive, inconvenient, or odd. It is that they represent a threat, either to order or to the self-conception of Western human beings who, since the Enlightenment, have viewed themselves as perfectible, as all-knowing, able over and above all other beings to conquer the limitations of their nature through the victories of their culture." A revised self-conception, one more honest about human limitations and interdependence, and hence less threatened by human variability, would allow people with impairments, a group that sooner or later will include many of us, to shed the stigma Shakespeare diagnoses. Further, as Leonard Davis and others have suggested, such a revised self-conception could make acknowledged and shared fragility a new foundation for solidarities and collective action. As I explained earlier, the social model of disability differentiates between intractable bodily limitations and the alterable cultural formations that determine the meaning and impact of those limitations. As the careers of Hofstra's disabled alums demonstrate, learning to distinguish between the two, between the intractable and the malleable, can enable transformative action. To close, I will introduce you to one more alum, citing just a few highlights of his brief but consequential career. Paul Hearn was born with a brittle bone disease that prevented him from growing more than 4 feet tall and frequently necessitated that he wear a body cast. Until he was 15, he attended school remotely. This is the 1960s, so if I explain to you what remote learning sounded like there, Zoom meetings might seem okay. So remote learning for someone like Hearn, and also for several years for someone like Connie Panzerino, meant that there was a speaker in their home and a microphone in the classroom, and they were connected by a radio frequency. So attending class meant listening to the speaker, overhearing what was happening in the school classroom several miles away. Hearn thwarted this isolation by developing a lifelong enthusiasm for amateur radio, which at that time functioned as a sort of internet or social media. He made contacts around the world, and after an earthquake in Alaska, stayed on the air for 3 days connecting survivors and their families. While attending Hofstra, he frequently navigated campus on a litter. That physical limitation did not prevent him from successfully running for student senate president, defeating future U.S. Senator Norm Coleman. All right, this is a picture of a Newsday article from the time. One of the things that actually I admire, I'm struck by about the article, is it nowhere mentions Hearn's disability, and the picture seems to be taken in a way that avoids capturing the litter that he presumably is reclining on, that he depended on. Although as Senate President, Hearn did not focus narrowly on disability issues, he did press Hofstra to allow disabled students to dorm. After graduating from Hofstra Law, he took a job with the Legal Services Corporation, intending to focus on poverty law. After 2 years, though, the Brooklyn office where he worked was relocated to the second floor of an elevator-less building, necessitating that colleagues carry him up and down a flight of stairs every workday. That experience prompted Hearn to establish an accessible legal services office to represent people with disabilities. He soon co-wrote the first handbook on the legal rights of disabled people. Later, as co-director of the National Council on Disabilities, an independent federal agency advising the executive and legislative branches, he played a part in drafting and advancing the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. Even in moments of great success, though, Hearn continued to discern which limitations were more or less intractable. A colleague has recounted his champagne toast that he delivered at a celebration immediately following the signing of the ADA. Hearn noted what the legislation would accomplish: bus lifts, ramps, reduced obstacles to employment. He then paused and cautioned, "But this law will not change the heart of the bus driver. It will not change the heart of the restaurant owner or the employer." He paused again, and in his toast said, "Here's to changed hearts." Those who knew Paul Hearn, and even the New York Times reporter who wrote his obituary, have affirmed that he was the sort of person who changed hearts. Now that you are Hofstra students, your heritage includes the careers and accomplishments of alums like Jacobson, Panzerino, and Hearn, who broke the spell of common sense, acquired the tools to argue with authority, and imagined a society different from the one they were born into. I encourage you to embrace that heritage vigorously. The faculty gathered here and the ones you will find outside this room are ready to help you do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Before we move to the next stage, I have to correct errors. Here's a lesson in life. Don't rely on lists. Always double check your lists. There are two of my colleagues who were left out of my introductions earlier. Professor David Klein from the Computer Science Department and Professor F. DeLay from Writing Studies. And here's a lesson I want you all to take to heart. When you make a really big mistake, own it, acknowledge it, and ask forgiveness. Because somehow in that whole long list of people that I presented to you, I failed to point out Ms. Peggy Ann Matuziak, who is the office manager and director of alumni relations and the person on whom you most depend whenever there's a problem. She's back there and she made all of this happen for us. So, my apologies. I won't forget the bags. Okay, so here we are. There's about half an hour left, and we don't just talk at you. We expect you to own your thoughts, your responses to what happened. So we have brought out this, this panoply of minds to help you initiate a conversation on the key issues that Dr. Rustici has shared with us. There's no rules to the conversation. However it goes is how it goes. I want you just to engage one another, think critically, think deeply, and have some fun along the way, okay? And I'll be back at the end. Hello again, everybody. I'm brought back to the beginning where, yet again, I'm cutting short conversations, short-circuiting the very thing that we are hoping or engaging in. Late night conversations in residence halls or in the cafeteria during the day. But I did promise that we would be done by 8 o'clock, and both because I know you have other things to do besides hang out with the Honors College, and also because my colleagues' time must be respected, I'll have to bring us to a close. But before I do, over there against that wall, you'll see these little brown lunch bags. Now, normally at an Honors College event, there is almost always food. It is almost, my background's Italian, it's almost a religious commitment, okay? However, with a crowd this big, COVID being what it is, we decided it wasn't a good idea to open up brownies and have everybody chewing and munching, etc. in this room slightly close. So, as you leave, and let's try and do it somewhat, not like everybody just having to stand on a line. As you leave, go ahead and grab a bag of goodies, and I think there's enough for even a few of you who are hungry to take a second one, okay? So let me, before you go and get your cookies, let me again, first of all, thank Dr. Rustici for a marvelous talk. Let me thank my colleagues for their time, their wisdom, and their compassion. And I will again thank all of you for putting your trust in Hofstra and in the Honors College. As I said at the beginning, we promise we will do the most we can to make sure your experience is everything you hoped it would be. Take care, have a good night, and I'll see you on Thursday. Grab your cookies on the way.